It gives me great pleasure to introduce Mike Daniels. As I'm sure many of you will know, that Mike and myself were colleagues for many years. Many years.
Many years.
We'll get the walking sticks out soon. And at Liverpool John Moores University. So Mike has recently retired from being senior lecturer in psychology at Liverpool John Moores University. He's also the editor of the journal associated with our section, the Transpersonal Psychology Review. And I think it's right to say that Mike and I stimulated each other very fruitfully over the period of time that we were colleagues. I think that, I say for myself, that having a colleague who was interested in the same kind of things that I was interested in was conducive to moving things forward. And at the same time, our interests were not always the same. We're not clones. And there were areas where we had stimulating discussions where difference was involved. And I think that was also a great creative dynamic. So I'm very grateful for Mike's work and ideas and teaching. He's author of a book, The Shadow Self-Spirit, or the other way around.
No, that's right.
I got it right. Which is an excellent book. If anyone wants to pick up a book on transpersonal psychology, I would say that's the book you should get hold of. Not only covers the ground extremely well, but it raises issues, and that comes into the subject today. I know quite a lot about Mike's views in the transpersonal area and about challenges that are being faced by transpersonal psychology, and I'm all ears. So, Mike,
I've got it. Okay, thank you very much, Les, for that very gracious introduction. I'll be reflecting on some of our kind of personal history and some of our personal differences of opinion, actually, during the talk today. Can you hear me okay? Is the sound level fine? Good. Okay, so yes, retrospectives and challenges is what I'm going to talk about. So I want to kind of start off with just a very quick run-through of the historical development of transpersonal psychology, just noting some of the key figures, the key influences, the key approaches in transpersonal psychology, and then looking at the successes, the main successes that the discipline has had in the last 100 years, because basically it's been going about 100 years, and where we are now as a result of that history and those successes. And then from that, to try and look at transpersonal psychology from a more critical perspective. What are the kind of criticisms that have been put forward about the discipline? What are the main conflicts and tensions within the field? And what are, as it says there, the challenges? What are the challenges for the future of transpersonal psychology? So that's kind of what I want to cover. As well as a walking stick, you'll have noticed I'm so infirm I need a lectern, because I'm at that age where glasses aren't quite right. So if I wear them on the end of my nose, those of you who are my age will understand why people wear them on the end of your nose. Okay, so the birth of transpersonal psychology. You can take your money and how's it go? Pay your money and take your choice. When did transpersonal psychology start? I generally say that William James kicked off transpersonal psychology with his Gifford lectures that he gave at the University of Edinburgh in the winter of 1901-1902, that were later, the following year, published as the Varieties of Religious Experience. Not only was James the first person to use the word transpersonal, he hyphenated it, Eugene Taylor has pointed that out, and that was in 1905. But one of the important aspects of James's work was his distinctly psychological approach to areas of experience that were beyond the ordinary. So he had an interest in psychical research, in mystical experience, in religious experience generally. But he emphasized, as a psychologist, the importance of looking at these phenomena not from a religious theological perspective, but from a psychological perspective. And then the next figure, Jung. Most of you are familiar with Jung's work. dated from his transpersonal approach, I've done there from about 1913, and his own psychological breakdown, and the Red Book, which is now published. Wonderful book, beautiful book, very expensive, but worth every penny. And again, one of the important things about Jung was his attempt to understand the mystical, the paranormal, the religious, from a psychological perspective, in terms of Jung's model of the archetypes of the collective unconscious, obviously. Jung was also very influenced by certain religious perspectives, again, as most of you will know, Gnosticism, Taoism, Christianity in particular, alchemy, another very important approach for Jung. One of the points I'm going to pick up later is one of the fundamental questions that Jung's work poses, which is the ontological question. James took a psychological approach to religion. Jung is taking a psychological approach to religion. Does that mean that the transpersonal spirituality is merely a psychological process, is merely psychological phenomena? Do these processes, spirituality, do they imply some kind of ontological, metaphysical, spiritual realm, or do they in fact deny the reality of an ontological or metaphysical realm? I'll return to that later. Jung himself was ambiguous. If you read Jung's writing, to the end of his life, he remained ambiguous about whether there was a God, or whether God was simply the God image, the archetypal image of God. Ironically, even though Jung claimed to be only looking at the psychological aspects of it and to be ambiguous about metaphysics and ontology, he's generally understood by most psychologists outside this field as himself a mystic and even an obscurantist. So his attempt to try and make psychology of spirituality psychological and non-metaphysical didn't work, really, because most people see him as a mystic. The next figure, I'm sure, again, will be familiar to most of you, Roberto Assagioli, Italian psychiatrist and the founder of psychosynthesis. His work actually predated Jung, his interest in the transpersonal. He started a PhD, which was published as La Psychosintesi, I think, which means the psychosynthesis. He started that in 1907. But 1910 was about when Assagioli started his work. One of the reasons that I've put Assagioli after Jung is that his influence in the Western world came later, because his work, his book, Psychosynthesis, wasn't published in English until 1965. And he wrote a book called Transpersonal Development. That wasn't published until 1993, after his death. And it was out of print for many years. Now, one of the points I want to return to later is the influence of religious ideas and religious ideologies within transpersonal psychology. And one of the interesting things about Assagioli is the very direct but hidden, secret, actually, influence of esoteric ideas in Assagioli's work. Assagioli's mother and Assagioli's wife were both theosophists. And it's clear, if you read Assagioli's work, that his theories are very strongly influenced by theosophical ideas, particularly some of the ideas from Hinduism, Vedanta, and Neoplatonism about the spiritual self, the Atman, and about reincarnation. What Assagioli tried to do was to deny that theosophical interest by claiming that his work was entirely psychological and not metaphysical. He's got a paragraph early on in Psychosynthesis, which is basically saying our work is entirely psychological. Entirely psychological. It isn't. Yes, if you read his work, and it's become clear over the last 20 years, people have looked at his work and looked at the influences from theosophy and also from his association with Alice Bailey, the esoteric teacher. Very strong connection there. And in many ways, his ideas, his psychological theories, are psychological translations of theosophical ideas and the ideas of Alice Bailey. The Beat Generation, the 1950s, we're moving forward. People like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs clearly influenced a whole generation. Dylan, the Beatles, environmental ecology movement, for example. Their idea of social and spiritual liberation was very key to the Beat Generation's approach. They were themselves influenced by earlier people, William Blake, the American Transcendentalists, Zen Buddhism and the work of Suzuki. Another important figure allied to the Beat Generation was Alan Watts, who popularized Buddhism, particularly Zen Buddhism, in the West through his books The Way of Zen and Psychotherapy East and West. And he saw, and people came to see, Buddhism as basically a practical and experiential religion. And that appealed to many people at this time who were frankly fed up with authoritarian traditional religious approaches in the West, which really denied people direct spiritual experience, and Buddhism was promising people direct spiritual experience. The 1960s, a time I remember well. If
you remember it, you weren't there.
So they say. So they say. Very vibrant, exciting decade, obviously. Gave us rock music, the space program, moon landing, the rise of feminism, sexual liberation. I think I missed out on that one. Civil rights, political protests and change, the whole counterculture, psychedelic drugs, the video recorder, the mini computer, colour TV, and if my wife, who's Scottish, will forgive me, she's not here, thankfully, England won the World Cup. But also in the 1960s, humanistic psychology as a discipline developed through, obviously, the work of Maslow and Carl Rogers, and Maslow's whole idea of we need this new force, this new optimistic, positive force in psychology as an alternative to behaviorism and psychoanalysis, emphasizing human potential, for example. But another important aspect of both Maslow and Rogers' work was, again, it was almost entirely psychological. There was no religious, ideological, spiritual impetus to it, unlike Assagioli, and unlike, to some extent, Jung. It was a very humanistic approach. It was about human beings rather than about our relationships to the supernatural. It was also very American in its approach, a very pragmatic approach to understanding self-actualization. And Maslow himself was an atheist, often called a mystical atheist, because he believed in mystical experiences, but these were really aspects of our own human nature, nothing to do with a supernatural realm. And for that reason, again, he's often identified as one of the key figures in humanistic and transpersonal psychology, because it is an attempt to be an entirely psychological approach. As was Rogers. Rogers, for most of his life, remained agnostic. In his later years, he turned to religion somewhat more. But all of his seminal work was done from a purely pragmatic, humanistic basis rather than from an ideological or religious basis. The hippies, psychedelics, started, I suppose, with the work of people like Aldous Huxley and his book, The Doors of Perception, that was published actually in 1954. He had this serious approach to psychedelics. Psychedelic drugs were an avenue to new realms of experience that had a significance. Yes. And many of you know, he took LSD so seriously that he asked his wife Laura, as he was dying, to inject him with, I forget how many milligrams of LSD it was, and he died with a smile on his face, you might say, under the influence of LSD. His death was very sadly unreported, because he had the misfortune as did Mother Teresa, of dying on the same day as somebody more famous, who was John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated on the same day that Aldous Huxley died. One of the other serious approaches to psychedelics was the Harvard psilocybin project in the early 1960s, started by Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, later Ram Dass, of course. And also Houston Smith was involved in the psilocybin project at that time. And it also gave us Walter Pankey's famous Good Friday experiment. It was done on Good Friday in 1962. So they were serious people who were looking at psychedelic drugs from a serious, mystical perspective. But, of course, there were also the more frivolous exponents of psychedelic drugs. Timothy Leary himself became somewhat kind of frivolous in his later days, rather over the top. Ken Kesey and his band of merry pranksters and their psychedelic bus called, I believe it was called Further, which was a kind of play on words. So there was that frivolous side too. And of course there was also the dark side of the psychedelic 60s with things like the Manson murders in 1969. Human Potential Movement and the Esalen Institute. The idea of trying to develop new experiential approaches to promoting human potential. Not relying on past traditional methods so much, but developing new psychological ways of people self-actualizing and realizing their potential. And the Esalen Institute really stood for that. It was set up in 1962 in Big Sur, California by Michael Murphy and Dick Price. And in its early days, it drew immensely significant figures to it who ran workshops and gave lectures there. Aldous Huxley, for example, before he died, Alan Watts, Gregory Bateson, Maslow, Will Schutz, Fritz Perls, George Leonard, Joseph Campbell, all these people taught at the Esalen Institute in its early years. Another aspect of the 60s, significant time, wasn't it, was the influence of Eastern philosophies and Eastern religions in the West, which again, as I said before, promised people direct spiritual experience rather than religious dogma. Zen was very important early on through the influence of the Beat generation. Many young people in particular, found that a little bit severe. The Zen stuff is a bit severe, to be honest, isn't it? So there was the more cuddly side of the Eastern philosophies. There was the Maharishi and transcendental meditation, the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, known at the time as the giggling guru. A kind of more user-friendly version of meditation than the very severe Zen stuff. Sri Aurobindo also became significant in the West at that time, particularly through the work of Haridas Chaudhuri and his association with the California Institute for Asian Studies, later became CIIS, the California Institute for Integral Studies. And also the work of Michael Murphy, who was very influenced by Aurobindo. And Tibetan Buddhism, too, became significant at this time. Yeah, so Sammy Ling in Estelmere in the Borders was set up in 1967 by Chogyam Trungpa. Many of you will have been there. Interesting place to visit. The whole Tibetan approach, the Vajrayana diamond vehicle approach within Buddhism became influential in the West largely through the work of people like Chogyam Trungpa. And then, also in the 1960s, we finally had this thing that was called transpersonal psychology. Before there was the transpersonal, and there was transpersonal psychology, but it was never really called transpersonal psychology. And at first, it was simply called the fourth force. Yeah, so Maslow had his third force of humanistic psychology. They decided, well, let's have another force. So you might say, well, why did you need another force? And interestingly, the fourth force of transpersonal psychology came about because there were many within humanistic psychology, within the third force, who were uncomfortable with all this spiritual nonsense. They wanted humanistic psychology to be entirely humanistic. about human beings, human experience, and nothing to do with the supernatural or spiritual or religious. Existentialism's fine, humanism's fine, but we don't want any of this mystical Eastern stuff. So, because there were many within humanistic psychology who did want to hold on to that, they said, well, what we'll do is we'll take our ball and play in our own backyard. And they created this movement called transpersonal psychology, and it was set up by Abraham Maslow, who, although an atheist, as I said, was a mystical atheist, as he saw mystical experience as very profoundly important. Anthony Sutich and Stan Grof were very significant in setting up transpersonal psychology as a discipline. And they did it by starting the journal. So the launch of the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology actually was the launch of transpersonal psychology as a named discipline. And that was followed up a couple of years later by the formation of the Association for Transpersonal Psychology. Now, as I've been speaking, you may have kind of thought, well, this is all happening in America. The Esalen Institute, Aldous Huxley was British, but he was living in America. The Beat Generation, pretty much America. Again, Alan Watts was British, but was more influential in America. And particularly the west coast of America. What was happening in Britain? What was happening in Britain in the early 70s was the work of John Heron, who set up what he called the Human Potential Research Project at the University of Surrey, which was set up in 1970. And this was actually the first university-based centre for humanistic and transpersonal psychology in Europe. And I actually tried to get a job with him. Unsuccessfully. In 1977, I was finishing off my PhD, living in an esoteric commune nearby, and I thought, oh, great, I'll try and get a job at the Human Potential Research Unit, but they closed down shortly afterwards, unfortunately, and I didn't get a job. So I moved to Liverpool, and as Les says, the rest is history. As well as John Heron, another key figure, most of us know him, he's not here this year, unfortunately, John Rowan, again a very important colleague and friend of John Heron at the time. John Rowan's background was in the human potential movement, in co-counseling in particular, in humanistic psychology, and in transpersonal therapy. And particularly influential was a book he wrote in 1976 called Ordinary Ecstasy. And that was probably the first book that introduced me to this thing called transpersonal psychology. It was in 1976. It's written a second edition much more recently, which has changed a lot, but that first book of John Rowan's was very significant. Also, somewhat earlier than that, the Centre for Transpersonal Psychology had been set up in 1973 in London by Ian Gordon Brown and Barbara Summers. Their approach was really from a Jungian psychosynthesis, Alice Bailey perspective. And it was aimed at therapist training, again, as many as you know, based upon those approaches. So again, I want to return to this theme later, the question of what I call ideological infiltration into transpersonal psychology. And you can sort of see aspects, elements of ideological infiltration maybe in the CTP at that time. Meanwhile, in America, very key important figures in transpersonal psychology, Stan Grof had moved to America from Prague, where he'd been doing research with LSD, and then LSD was made federally illegal in 1967 in the States. And he eventually developed, as you will know, holotropic breathwork as a way of getting similar experiences, maybe the same experiences as are produced by LSD, through legal means, through holotropic breathwork. And again, he's obviously important for things like his work on spiritual emergencies, the Spiritual Emergence Network that was set up in 1980. Ken Wilber wrote this very significant book in 1973. It was published somewhat later, called The Spectrum of Consciousness. And this was really the first attempt to systematize all the psychologies and philosophies of East and West. And, it's had a profound influence on the whole of transpersonal psychology ever since. I'm not going to say really anything more about Wilber's work, other than to point out that he has rejected transpersonal psychology. In fact, he rejected transpersonal psychology as long ago as 1983, and I'll have a look at why he did that and what it implies later. And his approach now, of course, he calls integral theory, and he set up his Integral Institute as a think tank for his integral ideas. And he's developed integral life practice as his practical experiential approach that people should follow if they want to become integral or integrated. Michael Washburn, very underrated writer. See, his work, I like Michael Washburn's work. He's coming from a psychoanalytic, specifically a neo-Jungian perspective. He's actually a philosopher rather than a psychologist. But he's written two very important books in transpersonal psychology from that psychodynamic neo-Jungian perspective. Professional recognition. We can blow our own trumpet, of course, because we stole a march on the Americans, finally. In America, transpersonal psychology got thrown out by the American Psychological Association on more than one occasion when attempts were made to have it recognized as what's called a division within the American Psychological Association. And the reason it was thrown out, various reasons. One was that the transpersonal psychologists couldn't really decide what transpersonal psychology was. Problem with the definition. Also, the APA didn't like this whole concept of spirituality, which sounded too kind of metaphysical and non-psychological. But also they said, well, we've already got two sections. We've got Division 32, which is humanistic psychology. We've got Division 36, which is psychology of religion. We don't need another one. But in 1996, the BPS established this section for transpersonal psychology. And again, here I must pay my own tribute again to David Fontana, without whom this section would not exist. Yeah, as you know, David with Ingrid and Martin Tracy were the founding group within the section. They basically established it. But it was it was primarily, certainly, the result of not only David Fontana's own professional reputation within psychology generally, work in educational psychology, for example, but also his smooth talking. Yeah, he smooth talked the BPS committees, and I think David explained this to me once, and he said, well, I kind of talked so much that they eventually said, well, I can't disagree with anything he said. Because they couldn't really disagree with it. It was always like that with David, wasn't it? You could never quite disagree with anything he said. And here we are as a result. And then, more recently, another very significant figure, in some ways I think perhaps the most significant contemporary thinker in transpersonal psychology, Jorge Ferrer, whose book Revisioning Transpersonal Theory was published in 2002. So that's literally just a very quick run through of kind of how we got where we are. What have we done in all that time, the last 100 years? Well, we've got these things. We've got organizations, we've got journals, we've got conferences, obviously. We've got academic programs. We've done some research. We've applied ourselves in various ways. And we've trained people. So it sounds like we've done quite a lot. And just, again, I'll quickly run through very quickly these. These are the main transpersonal organizations, starting with the Association for Transpersonal Psychology in 1972, Institute of Noetic Sciences, set up by Ed Mitchell, the astronaut, in 1973, Scientific Medical Network, also 1973, and so on. Yeah, they're the main internet. There are other ones, but they're the main international transpersonal organizations. Transpersonal journals. Again, there are other ones. In fact, Larry's mentioned another one recently, the BAS. Sorry, the journal is the journal, isn't it? the Journal for the Study of Spirituality, and we can add BAS, the British Association, to the organisations, really, on the previous slide. Journal of Humanistic Psychology, Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, Revision, International Journal of Transpersonal Studies, Journal of Consciousness Studies, and our own Transpersonal Psychology Review. So we've got journals. We've got academic programs in transpersonal psychology. The first one that was really set up was what is now the California Institute for Integral Studies, but originally, as I said, it was the California Institute for Asian Studies, very influenced, as I said, by Sri Aurobindo's work through Haridas Chaudhuri. And they changed their name in 1980 to CIIS. And they run master's programs. Saybrook Graduate School and Research Centre also run graduate programs, humanistic psychology programs, for example, and again, they've been doing that since the early 70s. Naropa University, set up in 1974, was founded by Chogyam Trungpa, who set up Sammy Ling in the Borders. And Naropa is basically, I think they call themselves a Buddhist-inspired liberal arts university. And they run undergraduate and graduate programs in things like contemplative psychology and transpersonal psychology. The ITP, Institute for Transpersonal Psychology, they founded themselves as a non-sectarian graduate school, and they run master's and PhD programs. They run a residential program. They run a low residency program. They run a global online program. The Centre for Transpersonal Psychology, let's say it was more practitioner training, but we should mention them. John F. Kay University, we're running programs in integral psychology and consciousness and transformational studies certainly in the 1990s. I'm not sure exactly when that started. Our own program that is still finishing off at Liverpool John Moores, which started in 1995, originally called The Psychology of Human Potential, and then rather quickly renamed Consciousness and Transpersonal Psychology for various reasons I won't go into. And we also have PhD students, of course. And then University of Northampton, I hope this date is right, but Chris will correct me if I'm wrong, I think started the Masters in 2008. You don't know either, do you? Was it earlier than that? It was when? Was it really? Goodness, when you get to my age, time flies. So what are the general successes of transpersonal psychology? Well, we've promoted a positive normative agenda. This really as a result of Maslow's work. Extensive research on altered states of consciousness, Charles Tartt's work, for example. Also the work on, I don't know if you call it alternate states of consciousness or not, but certainly the work on near-death experiences that Penny will be talking about tomorrow. Very significant success within transpersonal psychology. Research on meditation, extensive research on that. Development of new epistemologies and new methodologies, and again I'll be talking a little bit about epistemology and methodology later. We've got theories now in transpersonal psychology. We've got these methods of transpersonal practice. We've applied transpersonal thinking in areas like counselling, psychotherapy, and psychiatry. I mean, Larry's work that he was talking about the other day, a good example of that, as is Isabel Clark's work. And David Lukoff's success in getting religious or spiritual problem added to DSM-4, very significant. And we've got lots of books from I won't say we've got too many books, but we've certainly got lots of books in this area. So, if that's the case, we've got all these successes, we've got this history. Are there any problems? And what are the problems? And I would just want to start off with this quote from, you can't quite see the reference there, but it's on the Shambhala website. It's about Wilber's defection in 1983. I quit referring to myself as a transpersonal psychologist in 1983. I guess because I never said much about it publicly, few noticed that I had basically resigned from the movement almost 2 decades ago. But at the time, this was a very difficult decision, rather upsetting to me, and I didn't make it lightly. Question: do you consider yourself part of the transpersonal movement today? No, I don't. Tell us about that. Well, the basic difficulty is that transpersonal psychology, to its great credit, was the first major school of present-day psychology to take spirituality seriously. Yet because there is a great deal of disagreement as to what actually constitutes spirituality itself, there's a great deal of disagreement as to what constitutes transpersonal psychology. These are not minor inner tensions, as one might find, say, in the various schools of psychoanalysis or Jungian psychology. They are instead major internal divisions and barbed disagreements as to the nature, scope, and role of transpersonal psychology itself. This makes the field more rife with political schisms and warring ideologies. This is why I believe that in 3 decades, and aside from 1 or 2 specific theorists, himself, no doubt, included, the actual school of transpersonal psychology has had no major impact outside of the Bay Area. And it is today, many people agree, in an irreversible terminal decline. Wow. And he was saying that quite a few years ago. Yeah. I wouldn't disagree with you, but the question is whether he's got a point. So I want to consider whether he might have a point, despite that there might be other agendas involved in this. So let's have a look then. So what is, he's basically saying one of the problems is we can't even decide what transpersonal psychology is. So what is transpersonal psychology? Well, I went looking. I went on Amazon.com and I typed in inverted commas, transpersonal psychology, and it threw up 671 books. And they included books on all these areas. And I'm not going to name them all, but you can quickly look through them. A Course in Miracles, Chakras, I Ching, Kabbalah, Tarot, Yoga, Zen. A lot of different things. And for me, that raises some questions. And one question it raises is, if transpersonal psychology includes all those things, what is the difference between transpersonal psychology and the New Age, or the, quote, mind, body, spirit section in Waterstones? Is there a difference between transpersonal psychology and these things? If not, should there be a difference? And if there is a difference, what is the difference? Another question it raises is, quote, transpersonal psychology simply a fashionable umbrella term adopted to make these other ideas sound more modern or more scientifically respectable? Is transpersonal psychology, in inverted commas, simply too inclusive? Do we really want to include all these things within what we want to call transpersonal psychology? And if not, can we distinguish all of this jumble from what you might want to call a proper transpersonal psychology? And another question it raises, which is kind of related to that, is to what extent does transpersonal psychology risk what's been called myth-mongering? In other words, itself becoming a religion or becoming an ideology or promoting particular religions or ideologies. So, I mean, I'm not saying there's a simple answer to this, but one thing I'd like to suggest, perhaps, is that perhaps we can make a distinction between transpersonal psychology and what I call transpersonal psychologies. And transpersonal psychologies are these things. They're systems of spiritual belief and practice that have a psychological emphasis. Yes. So there must be a psychological emphasis, or it wouldn't really be a psychology. But they tend to be based on closed systems of ideas that are relatively impervious to debate, criticism, or evidence. And perhaps they bear some similarities to cults for those reasons. Certainly they resemble faith traditions. And again, I want to return to that issue very, very shortly. One of the aspects, again, of many of these transpersonal psychologies is that they have a limited research base. Often they're not interested in research, or any research that they are interested in is their own in-house research, as with transcendental meditation. Most of the research on TM is done by the TM people. So that raises some questions, I think. So what are these transpersonal psychologies? Well, they're pretty much the list that I had before, but I've added a few in. So I've added in things like analytical psychology, Jungian psychology. It's not transpersonal psychology in the sense that I'm suggesting, but certainly it is one of the transpersonal psychologies, as are things like Groff's holotropic psychology or Les's Kabbalistic psychology or landmark education or spiritualism or Sufi psychology. These are all transpersonal psychologies, but perhaps they're not transpersonal psychology. And if they're not transpersonal psychology, then what is? Where does it leave the transpersonal psychology section, for example? Where does it leave transpersonal psychology? Is transpersonal psychology, I haven't even said what it is, have I? But is transpersonal psychology simply another one of the transpersonal psychologies? Or does it actually have some kind of distinctive role, separate from these other transpersonal psychologies? And I think most of us would like to claim that it did, for those reasons. We like to claim that transpersonal psychology is somehow special because it's part of a profession of psychology. We have a BPS section. That somehow it's scientific and scholarly, that it's a science, and it's both a pure science, theoretical science, but also an applied science. And for that reason, it's worthy of funding by research bodies. Yeah, very important issue. And in particular, I think we would like to claim, most of us, that it is not itself a religion, cult, or ideology. But perhaps it provides a position or perspective from which we can view religions, ideologies, and other transpersonal psychologies. But we're not one of those ourselves. I think we would like to claim that, or many of us would like to claim that. So if we do want to claim that, what can we actually do as transpersonal psychology, rather than simply a transpersonal psychology? Well, we can do these things. We can debate. Transpersonal psychology can be an open forum for scholarly debate. We can research, develop our epistemologies and methodologies. We can undertake scientific research into spiritual and allied phenomena. We can come up with our psychological theories for these phenomena. From a secure, this is the important thing, I should have written this down really, from a secure base of psychological theory and research, we can perhaps develop ways to promote psychological, social and spiritual well-being. Not from a pre-given ideological base, but from a base of psychological research and theory. And again, from a secure base of psychological research, theory and practice, we can add practice in now, we can find ways perhaps of evaluating the psychological efficacy of spiritual practices. And maybe we can find a way of evaluating these other transpersonal psychologies from this secure base of psychological research, theory and practice. So perhaps we could do that. And in fact, that's what we claim to be doing. So quick, I'm not going to go through this, but you can find this in Transpersonal Psychology Review because it's published there in every issue. These are the original aims of the Transpersonal Psychology section. To examine these various things. History, nature, history, purpose of transpersonal psychology, the relationship between personality, motivations, and transpersonal things. I'm not going to read them through, but you can see them. Yes, we basically have always been claiming to be doing those kinds of things. Basically to examine these phenomena from a psychological perspective and to be doing research into it. Now, if we claim that the fundamental aim, and you'll note that all of those start off with to examine. That's really what we're doing in transpersonal psychology. We're examining. That clearly raises the epistemological question. How do we examine all these weird things? Again, I think, well, certainly I would like to claim that we should be doing it from an epistemological basis that is broadly scientific and scholarly. And that's based on evidence and empiricism and not on dogma or faith or tradition for its own sake. But if we're going to have this kind of scientific empirical approach, it needs obviously to be what William James called a radical empiricism that includes subjective experience, subjective observation, and also intersubjective observation. Wilber talks about the three I's. There are actually three main epistemologies in transpersonal psychology. There's the eye of flesh, or simply sensory observation, empirical observation, the method of natural science. But there's also the eye of reason, using rational demonstration, conceptual analysis, philosophy, basically. But there's also the eye of contemplation, which is direct spiritual knowing. And that raises questions of how do we know what we know is spiritual? And I'll return to that in a moment. But certainly what I'm saying is that transpersonal psychology has to be broadly scientific and broadly evidential, broadly empirical approach to knowledge. The word science basically means knowledge, versus what it shouldn't be is the promulgation of unsubstantiated opinion or second-hand experience. Yeah. Epistemology obviously leads then into methodology, and I'm going to skip over this very quickly. I don't think the methodological questions are really questions anymore. I think we've basically nailed the methodological issues in transpersonal psychology through the work of people like William Broad and Rosemary Anderson and their excellent book on transpersonal methods. Basically what they're saying is we can kind of do all sorts of things. We should have a very broad church, very inappropriate, that was my word, not their word, and very inappropriate in the context of what I'm saying. A very broad approach to methodology within transpersonal psychology. We should employ a pluralistic, multi-perspectival approach. Okay, let me just turn to the question that I just paused on now, the verification question. How do we know that knowledge in transpersonal psychology is valid, rather than just dogma and opinion? And again, Wilber claims that you can sort of try to nail this through looking at the three I's. So the way we know that sensory observations are true is we make them again. Or we get someone else to check. Is that yellow? Yes, it's yellow. I agree. The eye of reason. How do we know that a philosophical idea is correct? Well, if the ideas are internally consistent, and if rational persons agree that 1 + 1 is 2, then 1 + 1 is 2. The eye of contemplation, however, is more problematic. Supposing I claim to know God, or know what God is like. I've experienced God. How can I verify what I'm saying is correct, rather than it simply being a fantasy or an opinion? Wilber suggests that you can use consensus. So Wilber suggests, well, if your spiritual peers agree with you that if you meditate this way for 30 years you'll become enlightened, then it must be true. Or if a particular non-dual experience is like this, or a nature mystical experience is like this, and all your peers agree with you, then it must be true. Ferrer has really blown that out of court, I think, by basically saying that this idea that you can get consensus about spiritual experiences only works within a tradition. You can get agreements among your spiritual peers within a Buddhist tradition, maybe within a specific Buddhist tradition or within a Sufi tradition, but you can't expect to get consensus across traditions. And again, I'll return to that in a moment. And I just want to say a little bit more about transpersonal psychology as not being a faith, and why it isn't a faith, or why it shouldn't be a faith. What I mean, I suppose, by a faith is ideas that are based upon accepting spiritual doctrine or religious ideology or the word of some authority. And, I mean, one thing, again, I'd note is that the aims of the transpersonal psychology section are to examine. They're not to preach. It's not to preach this. That's not what we're doing. We're not a faith. There is a faith epistemology. There is what you might call a doctrinal epistemology. Perhaps you could even call it the eye of faith. which basically is based on second-hand experience. It's based upon what the masters tell you, what the doctrine tells you, what the tradition tells you. And you can verify it, I suppose, perhaps in some way through your own experience of your faith tradition. So let me return then to the question that Ferrer raised of whether we can get any kind of consensus between spiritual traditions. People within a faith tradition may agree that God is like this, or non-dual awareness is like this. But can we, from outside that faith tradition, make any statements? Can we evaluate it in any way? Ferrer suggests that there might be a way forward. He's basically suggesting that it's problematic because really you can only agree within a tradition. But there might be some way that we could stand back and say whether a religious claim made by another religion has any validity to it. And I'll return to what that might be in a second. But just one thing I just want to say right now, because otherwise you might misinterpret what I'm saying, is that actually, personally, I don't subscribe to any faith tradition. I don't have a faith or a religious tradition or practice. But I'm not trying to knock faiths. I'm not trying to knock faiths. Faiths are fine, although perhaps we can evaluate some as maybe being a bit dodgy. But in general, I've got nothing against faiths. All I'm really doing is pointing out the distinction between faiths and transpersonal psychology. That's really all I'm doing. And then I'm raising the question of whether we might be able, from a perspective of transpersonal psychology, to form an opinion, a valid opinion about the claims made within particular faiths. Yeah, that's all I'm saying. So let's get to the $64,000 question then. Can we evaluate faiths and religious claims? And this really is based on Ferrer largely. What Ferrer says is that a religion, a religious tradition, a faith, a spiritual practice is okay. He doesn't use that word, he's much more articulate than that, but basically is okay if it involves the overcoming of self-centeredness. He's basically saying all valid spiritual traditions, all valid spiritual practices essentially involve the overcoming of self-centeredness, which is not the same, and John Rowan has misunderstood him on this. It's not the same as saying selflessness. Overcoming self-centeredness is not the same as not having a self. Simply being non-narcissistic, non-egocentric, essentially. So that's the crux for Ferrer. If a religious practice or a religious tradition overcomes self-centeredness, that's the key test. But also that would result in, because you're not self-centered, religious tolerance and compassion. So there are two other tests. And there are certainly contraindications. If a religious practice or a religious faith tradition leads to spiritual narcissism, it leads to the exploitation of spirituality for your own egocentric purposes, or for materialistic purposes, for example, what Chogyam Trungpa calls spiritual materialism, then that's a contraindication. If it's what Michael Marion has called the sandbox syndrome, that's a contraindication, which basically means that, we have a jolly time playing in our little transpersonal psychology sandbox, and we go away at the end of the conference and pat ourselves on the back that we've done a good job. But actually we haven't changed anything in the world at all. We've just been playing our pleasant little game. If it's just a sandbox that we're playing in and it doesn't have any real world applications, then maybe that's a contraindication. And again, I'll return to what Eileen was talking about earlier, about actually we can have real life applications. Fundamentalism or absolutism is a contraindication. Yeah, so a faith tradition that is fundamentalist or absolutist, the I'm okay, you're not okay position, often associated with missionary zeal, colonialism, myth-mongering, peddling beliefs. Yeah, contraindication, maybe, from this outside perspective. And anything that leads to religious intolerance, again, would be a contraindication. So, again, this is pretty much almost the same list again. Faiths. These are faiths. And it's not to say they're bad faiths, necessarily. Some of them might fail the test of compassion and religious tolerance, but many of them wouldn't. So many of these, you could say, perhaps are good faiths. So they do lead to loss of self-centeredness. I want to return to the point I raised earlier about ideological infiltration. If I'm saying that transpersonal psychology isn't and shouldn't be a faith, is there the danger that actually in practice much transpersonal psychology has been infiltrated by faith? And it's actually peddling faith rather than peddling research. I've already mentioned the Saggiolian psychosynthesis and the influence there, the psychologizing really, of Vedanta, yoga, Alice Bailey, theosophy. CIIS at the Esalen, as I've said, we're very influenced by Aurobindo's work. Stan Grof's work is kind of infiltrated with this notion of reincarnationism. It's a word, I don't know if I've invented it or not, but anyway, it ought to be a word, even if it's not. Ken Wilber's work has been infiltrated with ideas from Advaita Vedanta, Buddhism, Aurobindo, and theosophy, and in many ways you could see it as an attempt to reframe some of those things. Psychical research, which I'm separating from parapsychology, obviously, here. Again, does it peddle spiritualism and peddle reincarnationism? Wilber itself has actually now become its own ideology. It's not simply peddling, perhaps, Aurobindo and Vedanta and Buddhism, but it's now Wilberism. And if you hear John Rowan sometimes, it certainly sounds like there's this thing called Wilberism, and the Integral Institute, again, sounds like Wilberism to me. So those approaches may be a little bit suspect from this question of whether transpersonal psychology ought to bracket off the faith stuff and become a non-faith tradition. So are there non-ideological approaches within transpersonal psychology that aren't really peddling anything? And yeah. And I'd just like to suggest these, really. I think these are not really peddling, as far as I can see. Charles Tart, perhaps, well, he's certainly influenced by Gurdjieff and Sufi ideas, but I'm not sure he really peddles them. And these other approaches, Maslow, William James, psychology of religion, positive psychology, parapsychology, consciousness studies, I don't really see them trying to peddle anything. And then I want to bite the bullet again in the last minute. Okay, I'm going to zip through these. Return to the ontological question. Is the consequence of what I'm saying that transpersonal psychology has to be ontologically agnostic? Or can it, while remaining not a faith tradition, can it accept the reality of some kind of metaphysical reality? So let's just look, first of all, at what could be real in terms of ontologies. Ontology is about what is real. Well, these things could be real. The physical world, the phenomenological world, the psychodynamic world, and so on. And then there's this thing I've got there, the last two. The metaphysical world, the world of angels and dakinis and gods and goddesses and so on. And then there's this thing that Ferrer calls the mystery. Some kind of spiritual reality beyond experience or beyond comprehension that we participate with. If those could be real, they result in various problems. And one of the problems is what is often called the hard problem. How does consciousness relate to a physical process like the brain? But actually, if you go back to this, there isn't just one hard problem of how phenomenology and the physical world interface. There are lots of other ontological hard problems. How does the physical world interact with the archetypal world or the metaphysical world? There's lots of hard problems. Actually, it's not just one hard problem. If we're not careful, if those things could be real, and if they are real, and I'm not saying they are, but if they were real, then there is always the danger of a category error in reducing a metaphysical reality to a purely psychological reality or purely social reality. Or the other type of category error, what Wilber calls elevationism, elevating some kind of personal psychodynamic issue to some grand cosmic scale, kind of spiritual megalomania. You mistake your own neuroses or psychoses with what's happening in the realm of metaphysics. And again, there are other issues that are raised here. The problem of ontological denial. The fact that some people just deny certain ontological realities, like Dawkins, for example. I'm going to carry on because I know Les will be interested in this, but because Les and I had a tete-a-tete in one of the issues of the Journal of the Transpersonal Psychology Review about this question of metaphysics. What is an appropriate position for transpersonal psychology to adopt in relation to metaphysics? And Les's argument, very good argument, is that, no, I'm not being sarcastic or ironic, it's a very good argument, is that transpersonal psychology has to be metaphysical because otherwise it doesn't mean anything. The idea of the transpersonal doesn't mean anything unless you believe in some kind of metaphysical realm. Some kind of spiritual or metaphysical conception is necessary. That's what Les is arguing. What I'm saying, which actually doesn't contradict that, and people like Jung and Maslow and Harris Friedman are also arguing something similar, is that we should try, if we can, to bracket metaphysics, or at least we should try to bracket particular metaphysical ideas. The notion that you need some kind of spiritual metaphysics, I don't have a problem with. What I have a problem with is saying that we have to believe in dakinis and auras and chakras and all this kind of stuff. Particular metaphysical beliefs, we have to buy into those. Ferrer I think, actually gives us the solution to this through his idea of metaphysical indeterminacy. There isn't just one metaphysic. There's an indeterminate number of ontological metaphysical realities that are actually co-created. That Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, for example, co-creates the Pure Land. That Christianity co-creates the kingdom of heaven, not just as a kind of fantasy, but actually as a reality. So there isn't any determined metaphysical reality. There is the mystery, and through our participation with the mystery, we can co-create metaphysical realities. And then so that finally begs the question where transpersonal psychology might stand in relation to that. Does transpersonal psychology need to co-create its own metaphysics? And rather than buying in a metaphysics. The danger I see is it's too difficult to co-create a metaphysics. It's much easier to buy in Aurobindo, or to buy in Wilber, or to buy in Vedanta, or to buy in Kabbalah or something. It's easier to do that than to actually co-create something genuinely new. So is transpersonal psychology, again, I'm going to carry on because I know we've got some discussion time tonight, so I'm going to carry on because I think this will maybe lead into some of the discussion tonight. Yeah. Is transpersonal psychology in crisis? Well, the short answer, of course, is yes. There's a lack of research funding. I know there are opportunities for research funding. Academic programs, as I know, are closing down in transpersonal psychology, have closed down. There aren't really any clear career prospects for most people entering transpersonal psychology. You've normally got to have some other string to your bow, and you do transpersonal psychology in secret or on the side, as you and I did, really. Yeah. So, I wasn't appointed to teach. I was actually teaching transpersonal psychology from the early 80s, as it turned out, but I wasn't appointed to do that. I managed to smuggle it in. I was appointed to teach developmental psychology and personality theory and statistics. Yeah, and I did that for most of my early years. And if you wanted to enter the profession and call yourself a transpersonal psychologist, it's still very difficult. It's always been difficult. And there is a danger that you just commit career suicide by nailing your flag to transpersonal psychology. Research famine. This is particularly pressing for me as the editor of Transpersonal Psychology Review. I'm just not getting enough research in. It's not being done. There's not enough actual good research being done in transpersonal psychology. There's relatively few specialist journals. None of those are in the league tables. None of those count. So if you're an academic and you publish in Transpersonal Psychology Review, it won't mean anything. It won't help your career at all. Even if you publish in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, it won't mean anything. Sometimes it's possible to publish in mainstream journals. Some of the near-death experience research, for example, has been. Some of the parapsychology research has been. But within the transpersonal psychology journals, the specialist ones, another issue is not simply that there's not enough being done, but what is being done isn't really empirical. In fact, less than 1/3 of the papers published in transpersonal journals are empirical. The rest of the 2/3 are theorizing, pontificating, speculating. What I've called here same old, we kind of go round in circles. I mean, I've been coming to this conference for 15 years. I've been to every one, I think. And it's great, and I love it. And I learn a lot, but it's same old, a lot. And you get that with a lot of the transpersonal conferences. And a lot of the theoretical debates are kind of same old. It's still Wilbur versus Washburn, and Wilbur versus Groff, and Wilbur now versus Ferrer, although Wilbur tries to ignore Ferrer. There's also the sense that maybe we are still a sandbox. It's same old sandbox, and we love it. We come here, we have a great time, and we sort of play for a couple of days, and we go off, and nothing maybe has changed very much. Also, another aspect of same old is the same old. The emphasis on tradition. I think there's still too much emphasis in transpersonal psychology on the wisdom of the past, and what we can learn from the masters, what we can learn from what the Buddha said, or what Jesus said, or what Muhammad said, or whatever. Yeah? That we need to kind of learn from traditional experience, because that's basically when it turns into a faith, because you're basing it on second-hand experience. Irrelevance or perceived irrelevance. Again, it's part of the sandbox syndrome. Are we really relevant? Have we really changed anything? Times have changed, obviously, in the last 40 years. We're in an economic crisis, but have we really changed with the times appropriately? So this is what I think we need. We need to step out from our sandboxes, to be less parochial, less precious. A lot of preciousness, isn't there, in transpersonal psychology? We're terribly precious about our own little bit. Spiritual narcissism, still a lot of that around, I think. We need more curiosity and less certainty. There are so many people who are dead certain about what they know or what they think they know. I think we need more of what Zen calls don't know mind. Don't know. Right, and much less certainty. We need more primary research, as I've said. We need to be more clinically, socially, and politically relevant. And again, I was very impressed with Arlene's talk today, showing how transpersonal psychology can be politically and socially relevant in that way. And also, Stuart made a point about his work in Afghanistan too. Where it has been more relevant, to be fair, is in psychotherapy and the clinical application. So I think the criticism maybe doesn't apply there. We need interdisciplinary dialogue with positive psychology, with parapsychology, with consciousness studies, with religious studies. And then finally, as I was saying before, I think we need to be a little bit more creative or co-creative in our approach. We need new ideas, we need new practices, we need new goals, new hypotheses, and maybe a new metaphysics that we can co-create. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mike. A great deal of food for thought.
Just a small question going back to the beginning of your talk when you were talking about Jung saying that he was ambivalent about God, I think you said. But in his 1960s...
You're talking about John Freeman face-to-face, I know.
For me, it is not a question of belief, I know.
Yeah, but he doesn't say what he knows.
He
looks very knowing. People, most Christians have read into that he's basically saying, I believe in God. But I've watched it many times, and he's got this cheeky little expression on his face.
No, well, I don't know if I could...
You won't believe that I'm going to ask a really straightforward question. You referred to metaphysics in two specific ways. The first time you said, angels and gods and things, and I love the sense of humour, and I know you're a very humorous man, but I have to just question that. And then at the end you said, we need a new metaphysics.
Yes.
Can you enlarge on those two?
Well, I wish I could. I wish I knew what the new metaphysics was, but it's something that needs to be co-created. If we are to co-create it, we need to come up with some new ideas as a discipline for what this metaphysics is, and maybe in doing that we do actually create some new metaphysical reality. I don't know what it is. No idea. But what I'm saying is it might be, it's not inconceivable that could happen. So I think Les thinks, or thought anyway, that I wanted to basically totally, as Dawkins does, totally deny any metaphysical reality. I don't. I'm quite happy with Ferrer, who believes in some kind of metaphysical spiritual reality called the mystery. Yes? And that through our participation through that, we can co-create different metaphysical realities. My complaint has always been that transpersonal psychology buys into particular metaphysical realities as being absolutely true, like the idea of a non-dual reality as being the ultimate, as Wilbur does. That's what I object to. Yes.
Okay. Well, I'll make one quick comment, which is kind of a question, and then I'm sure there's discussion later. Just to say, I'll make it a question so I don't break my own rules. Isn't there a difference between an author being influenced by a particular faith or a particular ideology or whatever it is, Aurobindo, for example, and bringing that in and shaping their work around that being influenced, and it is still open for discussion, for empirical questioning?
Yeah, no,
that's a big difference.
Yeah, no, I don't. That's fine.
Yeah,
I don't object to that at all.
That
yeah, and as long as we're honest about it.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's the infiltration thing I'm more suspicious about.
Yeah, exactly.
The way that these things are brought under the carpet.
Exactly. Okay, so there's plenty of food for thought in the discussion, and I hope you'll come along to that.